a cup of bagel. Hello everyone, thank you for coming or for coming back. Today I am unfortunately not going to be sharing one of my recipes. I am instead going to be answering a question, and this is a question that nobody asked, or at least a question that nobody asked me. And that is, why should I be scaling my recipes using grams instead of cups? Now, if you've ever found a recipe in a book or on a website, thought you wanted to make it, and then found out that it was measured using only weight and not volume, and you didn't have a kitchen scale, then it was definitely more than a little bit annoying. And today I want to try and convince you at least a little bit that you should buy a kitchen scale and switch over to measuring your recipes using grams. Now, the first reason I am going to give you is definitely the reason that is talked about the most. It is the one that is brought up most often because it is the most important one, and that is accuracy. Now, the example that people like to use most of the time with accuracy is a cup of flour. People will say, depending on how you measure, depending on the conditions, your cup of flour can be different almost every single time. And that is, of course, true. If you scoop your flour out of the bin, it's going to be a different cup of flour than if you scoop your flour into your cup using a spoon. It is going to be a different cup of flour. If you sift it, it's going to be a different cup of flour if it is a humid day out. There is so many factors that can change how much volume of flour you have in your cup, even though it is the same cup. And this is only going to escalate depending on how many cups is in your recipe. So if it is a recipe that only has a cup of flour and you're off by 20 grams because you scoop instead of spoon, then that maybe isn't going to be a big deal, and it's maybe not going to be enough of a reason for you to switch over to using grams. But if there's 4 cups of flour in your recipe and you scoop it instead of using a spoon, then now all of a sudden that's like, what did I say, 20, 40, 60, that's 80 grams. That's an 80 gram difference in your recipe because you measured it the wrong way. Now, if you're using grams, then it's going to be the same. No matter how much you compact, like 100 grams of flour, it's still going to be 100 grams of flour. The weight doesn't change depending on how packed it is. Now, I really like this example, but I also think that it can be a little bit confusing, and I think that it can be made even easier to understand by just changing the flour in that cup to something a little bit bigger, like a pecan. Now, pecans are obviously big and they are irregular shaped, so if you put a cup of pecans in a cup, there are going to be little empty spaces and little gaps. Now, if you think about those empty spaces, that is all the places where your cup of pecans isn't even pecans. Now, if you take these nuts and you dump them out and you chop them up really, really small, then you put them back in the cup, it is going to be the same volume of pecans as before, but it will have changed. Somehow, all of these empty spaces are now filled in, and you can fit more chopped pecans into this cup. Now, that is a little bit like the flour. That's just having your pecans condensed, just packed down in there. Now, this is sort of crazy to me because with weight, 150 grams of pecans chopped up is still 150 grams of pecans. No matter how small you make them, it's still going to be 150 grams. And this is one of the great reasons to switch over to grams instead of cups. But that is not my only reason, so if you're not convinced yet, then keep listening. So this next one will definitely apply to you if you've ever made a recipe or if you've ever started with a recipe and adjusted it over time to make it better. Now, generally, you won't go changing a recipe in giant amounts at a time. You just change it little by little over time, and that's how you improve without going crazy off the rails and getting something that you didn't want. So maybe you'll go and you'll be like, this batter's a little bit too loose, I'm gonna add a little bit more flour. Now you're probably gonna add, if you're using volume measurements, an extra tablespoon of flour. But now what do you do to denote that in your recipe that you want to do that next time? You'll have to write down that it's 2 cups plus 1 tablespoon of flour. And that is definitely just a little bit of extra hassle that you don't really want to have. Because if you're doing the recipe next time and you have to measure out 2 cups of flour and then pull out this whole extra spoon to get another spoonful of flour, then that's just a little bit of extra work, versus if you were using grams, you could just change from 580 grams of flour to 590 grams of flour with no extra work. And I know this seems really small, but it's all these small differences that add up. That is the reason why you should switch from grams to cups. Cups to grams. Now, the last point that I want to bring up in this accuracy category is what even is a cup? Now, I don't know if you know this, but there is a metric cup, there is an imperial cup, and there is a US cup. These are all different measurements of what is in a cup. Now, the US cup is 240 milliliters, the metric cup is 250 milliliters, and the imperial cup is 286 milliliters, and that is a crazy difference. So if you're using your cups and they're 250 milliliters, but you're using this recipe from someone who is using imperial cups, then there's going to be a 34, 36 milliliter difference in every single measurement that you do. So that is crazy difference. And if you're using grams, then this is standard. A gram is a gram no matter where you're from. So it's going to be the same across the board, and you don't have to worry about what sort of gram someone is using because they're the same. Now, the next reason that you should switch over to grams instead of cups is definitely one of the smaller and less important ones, and it is also probably something that applies to you more if you are baking at home than if you are baking professionally, but this is easy cleanup. Now, if you are measuring using cups, then you're going to need your full lineup of cups, your full lineup of tablespoons and teaspoons to measure. Now, I know that this maybe isn't a lot and you're like, whatever, I can just throw them in the dishwasher, but just think about it. If you're using grams, all you need is your scale and your mixing bowl. You can measure them all into your mixing bowl or into the mixing bowls that you will need for your recipe, and this is just that tiny bit easier. It's that tiny little bit of hassle that you don't have to put up with, which again adds up to the reason why you should switch to grams over cups. Now, my last category of reasons why you should switch to grams instead of cups definitely applies a little more to professional baking, but this is how you scale and order things for your recipes. So if you have ever had to increase a recipe by doubling it, quadrupling it, anything like that, then you will know that this is so much easier to do with weight. Because if you have a cup of flour that you have to turn into 4 cups of flour, that is 4 times the amount of scooping, especially if you are doing that whole spoon your flour into your cup one at a time sort of thing. It is so much easier to just look at, okay, 150 grams times 4, and then you have 600 grams, and it's so much easier. But again, you should really be using baker's percentage for that, but that's a whole other thing. Now, the other thing with scaling is scaling your portions. Now, if you know how much every ingredient weighs going into your batch of bagels, then you will know how much weight there should be in your final batch of dough, so you can tell how many bagels you can get if they are this many grams. This is so much more difficult to tell if you are using cups, because you'll have to look at it and be like, a cup of bagel? This is also so much easier if you have to change your portions. If you're having trouble with your portion size, you can scale it up or you can scale it down. You can find out your new yield and even use that to change the pricing if you need. So much easier than if you are using cups. And the last thing within this category is ordering. And I'm just thinking that if you're trying to order the amount of flour that you need for these many recipes, then they're not going to tell you that this is a 20 cup bag of flour. I know that'd be a really small bag of flour, but they're not going to tell you how many cups is in the bag of flour. They're going to be like, this is a 20 kilogram bag of flour, and you're going to have to figure that out for yourself. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to scoop 20 kilograms of flour into a cup to find out how many cups is in a kilogram. So I hope that I have convinced you at least a little bit to consider switching from measuring using grams to measuring using cups. And I really don't want to have you think that this is like a big monumental switch that'll take forever and so much money. I personally only have 2 scales. I have one for my standard measurements and I have a small one for when I have to measure things like yeast or baking powder that I might need to measure to 1/2 gram or less. And honestly, these scales are not expensive. This isn't something that you're gonna have to go and save up for. I know that scales maybe used to be really hard to find or really expensive, but they are electronics and you can find them anywhere now. I don't think either of my scales cost me more than $20, and I think one of them was also bought at Canadian Tire. So this isn't something that you have to make a big deal out of. It's not like you have to throw out your cups and switch to just using scales, but it is something that I think is really important if you want to be a little bit more accurate. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time. Bye.